March the 6th, 2026. Guys, you're looking at the energy futures. The market's open in about 13 minutes from now. By the time the video gets up, they will be open. It is 8:17 a.m. They open at 8:30 Central Time. What you're looking at, Brent is over $90 a barrel. Oil at $87.70. Natural gas, $3. Everything's going up is the point. Murban crude, $99. But $90 a barrel, guys, when just a week ago, we were looking at much different numbers. For the start of the conflict, our oil, guys, we were cruising around $61, $62 a barrel. And the president and his administration kept on bragging, we've got the gas prices down. And I agreed with them. They did have it down, and it was much more affordable. Now, that's changing because the Straits of Hormuz are still closed. And Iran, they're under a lot of pressure. So is everyone in the Middle East and the U.S. But Iran, and they do it all the time. It's kind of like a temporary white flag. They want to talk now. But Trump said there will be no deal, I'm going to quote him, except, quotation marks, unconditional surrender. Now, that has a lot to do with pride. And you understand that. I understand it too. But sometimes you have to set a little bit of that aside. I'm not saying let that regime come back, but you've got to get in there and do something, get the straits opened up, because oil is just the beginning of the problem. Remember, 80% of the food going into that section of the Middle East comes through the straits, going in the opposite direction that the oil's coming out. So they're in trouble on that. But again, let's just look at a couple of these charts. And it's not good. Guys, what we're going to do is, again, this is ICE Brent crude, May futures. We're going to go back for 1 month before the conflict and into the current month of March and look at the difference in the Brent crude prices. Now, let me bring it back. I think our low point was around the 11th right here. Now, this is Brent. This is the good stuff. This was at 66.52. Our low was 67.42 in the last 30 days. But here things started changing. This was the wars and rumors of war period. Then this is where it started, right there, quickly. From 72.48, we went to 81.40. It held there for a day or so. Here we're at 90.41, 90.20. And I've watched it jump this morning in the futures again, across 90 2 or 3 times, back to 89. But you know what this means, don't you? We're talking about getting into the $4 and $5 gallon gas very quickly. And it's for people like me that are semi-retired and we don't have to travel a lot to work and things like that. It's the oil or the gasoline is not as big of a deal. No, but for years I worked and commuted an hour both ways, and then it would have made a lot of difference. And it's going to make a lot of difference because a good portion of the population still has to go through that. And then work trucks, if you have your own work vehicle and you're traveling all over the city or all over the county, that adds up very quickly, and all of that has to be passed down or passed up, any way you want to look at it. And so what we're going to see is a shock in prices, starting with oil. But because of the straits and the price of oil already in the May futures, the price of groceries are going to go up because of the delivery cost of the goods. You got electric diesel trains, you got diesel 18-wheelers. Diesel's all involved in this, especially when you look at some of the bases there in the Middle East getting hit that handle the best diesel in the world that comes out of that area. Now, if you go back a full year, again, notice it just dropped from 90 back to 89.53. Markets will open now in 7 minutes. We'll see what's happening. But again, these are futures. But this is 1 year. And you'd have to go back into I think 1980, starting there, you started seeing these $100 spikes, $130 at one point during different problems with other administrations. But this, again, in the last year, we've seen a great decrease in the price of oil, and all of that's been erased now. So a couple of weeks ago, not only was I talking about this, but a lot of you guys in the comments were telling everybody, fill your vehicles up now. You remember that? Now now you waited a little late. It's like getting into the gold or silver game once it gets real high. When you go into, now you got to go buy the gas. It's not like you can just say, I can back away from that purchase at this point. But it'll go back to a lot more commuting, people piling up in one vehicle, things like that. It'll take a little while, but it's going to change, and then the cost of everything is going to be affected. Let's drop down to just the oil column, but it's the WTI crude, and this is for April 26th. This is coming out of the New York Exchange. WTI is West Texas Intermediate, if I'm not mistaken. Again, look at it, 87.31 today, up $6.30 per barrel. And a barrel of oil, if I'm not mistaken, guys, isn't like 50 gallons, isn't it? 44, something like that. Somebody correct me. A little smaller than you think. And this 1 month chart is almost a mirror image. Again, around the 11th, we were getting very low numbers, 61.87 a barrel. And that's what it takes. They always have said since, I guess for 20 or 30 years now, the oil industry needs $60 a barrel in order to stay alive, to pay the people, to pay the cost, and to make a dime. After that, it gets better. But we were nearly at that point, and that's about as low as it's going to get, guys, if you've got to keep the oil industry intact by paying the 60 a gallon up a little bit. But right here, this is going to get very hard to deal with. 87.30 as we speak right now. Market opens in 4 minutes. Now, this is the latest I can find, and this is coming from Sea Trade Maritime News. It says, as of March 6 today, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to most international commercial shipping, though its legal status remains a point of contention between Iran and the international communities. Regardless, the insurance people have backed off. That shut it down alone. Now, yesterday, Iran announced that China's ships could pass, their ships, and possibly Russian ships. Maybe one or two others, I'm not sure, but for sure China, okay? They could pass unimpeded, I think, but one U.S. ship came through, and possibly one Chinese ship has come through. The U.S. ship more than likely snuck through, I'm not sure, but I was just looking at some of the maps of the shipping. Anyway, that is a big problem. The reason I say that is, even though they're saying they're going to allow China ships in and out, how does China work with Lloyd's of London? Things like that, the big insurers, or is China independent from that and they have their own insurance? In the information yesterday, again, they're calling it selective passage. Iran has recently clarified that the closure is directed at vessels from the U.S., Israel, and Europe. Some reports indicate that only Chinese flag ships are currently permitted to pass. Now, if you think about it, we were talking about the Middle East, a lot of their food comes through the Straits. But Iran's coastline goes much further south into the ocean than just the Straits. So they have other ports. Whether or not those ports are in good shape, I have no idea. But Iran does have other means of shipping products into their area. It says the U.S. Central Command, called CENTCOM, continues to maintain that the strait is legally open and has not formally recognized Iranian blockade. It doesn't matter what CENTCOM says, it's the insurance companies. And they're saying the maritime traffic through the strait, again, 70% down. Major global shipping lines, including Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk, CMA, CGM, have suspended all transits through the waterway. Most insurers have withdrawn more risk coverage for the area, making it economically unviable for ships to enter. It's less expensive for them to sit there, let the goods rot if it's food, that has to be, it doesn't have a long shelf life, things like that. It's cheaper for them to take those losses than it is to lose their insurance. It says global oil prices have surged, Brent crude rising nearly 15% since the onset of the current crisis, as the strait handles roughly 20 to 30% of the world's seaborne oil. And that's my Smokey over here. He smells biscuits cooking in the kitchen, and he's fussing. He wants one now. Now, Trump has indicated the Navy may start escorting tankers. We talked about that maybe 3 or 4 days ago. We had a couple that were hit. But the legal standing under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which the UN is pretty much a toothless organization, Iran is generally prohibited from obstructing transit passage, but Tehran argues it has the right to control the waterway during wartime. Technically, they have 12 miles out, and it's 21 miles wide. Now, they're saying that right now, the primary countries that are impacted are in Asia, who receives nearly 90% of the oil and 80% of the liquefied natural gas passing through the waterway. So Asia is sucking up most of everything that comes out of there. Now, Asian economies face the most direct risk due to the extreme reliance on Middle Eastern energy imports and limited domestic reserves. This is coming from Zero Carbon. The world's largest importer is China, and that's, of course, oil, receives approximately 38% of all oil that flows through the strait. It also imports roughly 90% of Iran's total oil exports through this route. 90% of what Iran is doing is being sold to China. Now, India receives 15 to 19% of the Straits oil flows. Over 50% of its total crude oil and natural gas exports move through there. Japan, due to sourcing 80 to 90% of its oil from the Persian Gulf, it ranks as the country as the highest direct risk when accounting for total energy dependence. I think they have some strategic reserve, but I don't know if they have a lot of production. Then you got South Korea, guys. We don't have any information from North Korea, but South Korea sources 60 to 70% of its crude oil through the strait and relies on fossil fuel imports for 81% of its total energy usage. Pakistan and Bangladesh face acute physical strain regarding LNG, the natural gas. They import nearly 2/3 of their local or total LNG supplies via the strait and lack the storage capacity to handle prolonged disruptions. In other words, they can't store up enough. It's kind of like Walmart. It can get empty pretty quick. You got to have trucks coming all the time. So luckily, the weather is possibly going to be a little better. But guys, this is going to be prolonged, and you can't just crank everything back up instantly. So again, be prepared for food prices. This is not something I wanted to talk about. I didn't want to talk about higher oil. I didn't want to talk about higher food or any kind of higher prices. I was hoping our nation was on recovery and that something like this happens. But this could end quickly, and it wouldn't take that long to get back into some kind of decent shape. But there's been a lot of destruction. We're not getting mainstream reports about the multiple oil facilities that have been struck in the Middle East, not just Iran's, but they've reached out to UAE, Bahrain. All of those areas have had places hit. And now Iran is breaking out the big boy missiles. And another international law that they've broken is they're using these multiple warheads on the end of their giant rockets. They've been fixed to where, as these giant rockets, these things are 40 foot long, about 5.5 feet wide, weigh a couple tons. And as they're coming in, they're hard enough to shoot down. But then it looks like a science fiction movie, and I'm going to show you an image of where these things were coming in last night. And it's amazing, and it would be impossible to take all that out. We're not being told of all the damage being done, not only in Israel, but in some of the other locations that are part of, I guess you would say, the U.S. Ally Coalition. So we have several factors, guys, that could push this thing to a closure, and that would be good. Now, we're talking about exports, but again, people getting exports, but how does Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Iraq, how do they make money? For these nations, the strait is the only sea route for their primary economic engine. It says Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. These nations have no alternative sea routes for their exports. Qatar is especially hit as it accounts for 20% of global LNG exports, almost all of which pass through the strait. Iraq highly depends, as it has no other outlet for southern Basra crude, which makes up the majority of its production. In other words, they can't sell, they can't buy food, and from coming through the strait, so they're going to push for closure. Now, that's a good thing. We need this thing closed out very quickly, reestablish some sense of stability in the economic market, get our troops back home. Now, the big boys there, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, says while they are the largest exporters through the strait, 37 and 13% respectively, they have limited bypass pipelines to the Red Sea or Gulf of Oman. However, these pipelines can handle only a fraction of their total export volume. We talked about that a few days ago, too, and I don't know if I mentioned it. I ended up looking up, and it was a small percentage that they could get through if they only had the pipelines. And then Iran, despite initiating the closure, Iran suffers economic self-harm as the blockade halts its own oil exports, which provides $67 billion in revenue and did in the last previous fiscal year. $67 billion. As we're spending, the Department of War has said they are estimating $1 billion a day is what it's costing us to have our military there. And how close that is, we don't know, because I can remember going back a few years, and the Pentagon had trillions unaccounted for. I guess nothing happened to that. I mean, no one was ever brought to justice, just our tax money gone, like we're seeing now. You know, most of the world's facing rising fuel, freight, and food costs as oil prices surge towards 100 and 130 per barrel. We just saw 90 already. U.S. impact is limited, but guys, I think this is kind of twisted. The impact is limited due to high domestic production. It receives only 2.5% of its oil flow from the strait. That's true. We frack a lot. We have some strategic reserves here. We're importing now a lot of oil, from what I understand, from Venezuela since Maduro's been removed. That was kind of a preliminary chess move, possibly. But the impact is going to be the gas and food for our citizens here. Russia may see increased demand and revenue as Asian nations look for alternative energy suppliers outside the Middle East. Again, Putin knows how to play chess too. Malaysia, an energy exporter, it is positioned to be a relative beneficiary of higher global prices. Now, again, their economy lies on exports. Same with Saudi and the UAE and the Middle East, all countries there. So, in a way, of course, the citizens will see higher prices. But the exporters, alternative exporters, let me put it that way, they will end up making a lot of money if the Straits shuts down very long. Now it's 8:46 a.m. The markets are open, and this is live modeling from the Straits of Hormuz themselves. And we got backed up traffic on both sides, guys. Your circles are usually anchored boats, and again, coming right up to the Straits, just not a lot happening here. I think 2 ships were reported that came through. Again, if Iran was going to become more desperate, because they'll say they want to talk peace and then they'll do something else. But they could very easily set mines here. I showed you the video to where they have commandeered and have used smaller recreational fishing boats and then re-equip them to handle the mines, get in and out real quick, not a big ship doing that. And that would slow things down. Again, it would also create another insurance problem. But guys, just something kind of has something to do with this in a way, but just on China. They've always been a bully in many ways, and I think most of their leaders are very evil. I've said that for a long time ago. How many remember the video series I did? I've done a couple of them, but about the great comet that took out the Chinese fleet right before complete world dominance. They had to retreat. The comet hit. wiped out most of their giant ships, and their ships were huge compared to ships like the Mayflower and all that. Anyway, wiped out most of that. The fleet, a comet, they watched it come in and hit south of Australia. They were coming around New Zealand, half the fleet going, they were all going north, half was on one end or one side of New Zealand, half on the other side. Both sides got hit. They found remains of ships, guys, that were all the way to Easter Island from there and 500 feet up in the cliffs because the tsunami was so high from the impact, and the ships had burned before they got into the caves and the crevices at 500 feet. But China's coming back, and their Silk Road Initiative and all is just a repeat of the days when they traveled the world back then, even the U.S., even the Gulf Coast states. Of course, it wasn't called that then. And they had, if the local people were friendly to the Chinese, they would buy and trade and sell. If they weren't, China would just take over and force mining or whatever, whatever raw materials or whatever. But these brown dots are Chinese fishing vessels. Now, Iran has given them permission to fish here, and they had to stay at a certain depth. They couldn't do any bottom dragging. They had to do, just netting, no electrical fishing, what they call pulse fishing, that forces them all up. But now they've been busted doing all of that, dragging the bottom, running the fishing for the local industry. And these are all Chinese fishing vessels, breaking the law. And that's why the world gets all of its things depleted because of greed. But this is the Zing Bang 901. Notice that fishing, Chinese flag here, and the fish symbol there. And all of these are, look at this, Chinese fishing vessels taking advantage, and the Iranian fishermen have been complaining. Of course, the mullahs don't care about that. They want the money. But, I just had to point that out, guys, because look at that. That's a cluster. They were allowed to be there, but they've broken every law. And they say about half of these, and maybe more than half of them, also are collecting information for the Chinese military. Iran, I don't know what to think about you there, but everybody does it. But guys, this up in here is getting bad. These ships can't go out. They can't export oil to the nations that need it. The ones on this side can't bring in the food. It's just piling up back here. So again, they're using the alternative routes, going down around India, here, going down around Africa, coming out of the Straits of Gibraltar here. But it costs them, I think, 8 to 12 extra days and millions more in cost to do that. Who gets that price rise? The consumers do. So all of this deflection back in this direction, guys, is very costly to every one of us, everybody on the planet. So I talked about it in a video 3 or 4 days ago about this could lead to a war of desperation around the world. And again, leading into what I think we're going to see as the Gog and Magog war, or the beginning of it. Now, I'm going to back out, but I'm going to attach a short video, and it's from last night, and it was over Tel Aviv, if I'm not mistaken, from the webcam, and it shows one of these giant Iranian rockets I was talking about, 40-foot long, one of their big ones, and they can go Mach 8. Anyway, they're hard to stop because they're so large and fast, but they're starting now to put the multiple warheads, and just before like an Iron Dome missile comes up and gets them or hits them or something, they're shooting out these multiple warheads, guys. It, again, looks like a science fiction movie. Some people have said these are AI images. I can tell the difference, and you can too. But I'm going to back out of here. I'm just going to show that at the end, guys. We're watching it. You watch it. It's a heads up. Be safe. But notice the warheads.
They've been on the receiving end of this several times so far. The Israelis have said that they've been on the receiving end of this several times so far since the war started last week. 10. It is a cluster munition. Of course, cluster munitions are banned under an international treaty, but only if the countries themselves are signed up to that convention.